The station master's bell echoed with a tired, tinny sound through the cavernous hall of Silver Creek Station. Last call for the 10:15 the Denver Night Express, all aboard." The voice was as worn as the polished oak benches. For Elias Thorne, standing on the platform with a single, worn leather suitcase, the words were a sentence. This was it. The last train. Not just for the night, but the last train he would ever take from the only home he'd known. Silver Creek was a mining town bleeding out its last. The mountains that had once roared with industry were now quiet, scarred with empty shafts and silent machinery. Elias was part of that exodus. The factory had closed. The savings were gone. Denver was the promise of a job, a cousin's couch, a chance to start over at 58. He felt the weight of his years and the heavier weight of failure as he handed his ticket to the conductor. The train itself was a relic, a great, sighing beast of steel and steam. He found a seat in a near-empty carriage, stowing his case overhead. The compartment smelled of coal smoke, old upholstery, and a faint trace of disinfectant. He preferred the window, wanting one last look at the receding lights of the town as it was swallowed by the vast, impersonal darkness of the Colorado night. Just as the conductor gave the final whistle, the carriage door slid open with a crash. A young woman stumbled in, her breath plumbing in the cold air. She was wrapped in a coat too thin for the mountain winter, her face pale and etched with a desperate urgency. In her arms, she clutched a bundle of blankets from which came a tiny, mewling sound. "Thank goodness," she whispered, collapsing into the seat opposite Elias. She rocked the bundle gently, her eyes wide and fixed on the window as the train began to pull away from the platform with a great, groaning lurch. Elias gave her a brief, polite nod before turning back to his own window. He wasn't in the mood for conversation. His own sorrow was a private, gnawing thing. But as the lights of Silver Creek vanished, leaving only the reflection of the carriage interior on the glass, he found his gaze drifting back to his companions. The woman couldn't have been more than 20. Her name, she offered after a few miles of tense silence, was Cora. The baby was her daughter, Lily. She offered no last name, and her eyes darted towards the door at every slight jolt of the train. She was running, that much was clear. "Denver?" Elias asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes," Cora said, her grip tightening on the baby. "A fresh start." Elias simply nodded. He understood the sentiment. The night deepened. The train clattered through sleeping towns, their stations dark and empty. Cora finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head leaning against the window, but her sleep was fitful. Lily began to fuss, a thin, worried cry that grew in intensity. Cora jolted awake, flustered, trying to shush her, but the baby's cries only sharpened. Elias watched for a moment, the sound grating on his raw nerves. Then, without a word, he reached into his suitcase. He pulled out a small, smooth stone, gray with a single white vein running through it. It was a worry stone his daughter had given him a lifetime ago. He held it out to Cora. "Here," he said. "The coolness, the smoothness, sometimes it distracts them." Cora looked skeptical but desperate. She gently pressed the stone into Lily's tiny hand. The baby's cries hiccuped. Her fingers closed around the strange object. She brought it to her mouth, gumming it thoughtfully. The carriage fell silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track. A fragile truce was struck. Cora offered him a piece of hard bread from her pocket. He shared his thermos of bitter black coffee. In the shared space of their flight, they began to talk. Cora's story came out in hesitant fragments. She was fleeing a man, the baby's father, a man with a temper and a possessive streak that had curdled into something dangerous. He told her she'd never leave Silver Creek. She'd waited for the last train, the one he'd never expect her to take. Elias, in turn, spoke of the factory closure, of 30 years of work ending with a pink slip, of the shame of leaving a town he'd helped build. He spoke of his wife, buried in the cemetery on the hill, and how the thought of leaving her behind felt like a second betrayal. "It's not running away," Cora said softly, looking at his grief-lined face. "It's just taking a different track." Around midnight, the train shuddered to an unscheduled halt in the absolute middle of nowhere. A voice crackled over the intercom, apologetic. A signal failure ahead. They would be stopped for an unknown duration. A collective groan went through the few passengers. It was then that Cora saw them. Through the frosted window, two figures emerged from an idling truck parked on a dirt road that paralleled the tracks. Two large men, their breath smoking in the beam of a powerful flashlight, which they now swept across the carriages. "He sent them," Cora whispered, her voice trembling with pure terror. She shrank down in her seat, pulling Lily close. "They're looking for me." Elias saw the panic in her eyes. He saw the flashlight beam dance closer. He was an old man, tired and defeated. He had no fight left in him. But as he looked at Cora, at the tiny, sleeping face of the baby, something stirred, an ember of purpose he thought had long gone cold. This wasn't just about a job or a house anymore. This was about something simpler, something more important. "Get down," he said, his voice low and firm. "Stay out of sight." He stood up, his joints protesting, and walked calmly to the end of the carriage. He slid the door open and stepped out onto the small platform, closing it behind him. The cold was biting. The two men were already on the track bed, approaching. "Evening," one of them grunted, shining the light in Elia's face. "We're looking for a girl, young with a baby. You seen her." Elias squinted against the glare. He could feel the worn wood of the platform under his feet, the vast, indifferent night sky above. He thought of his wife, of the kind of man she had believed him to be. "This is the last train to Denver," Elias said, his voice steady. "There's no young girl with a baby on this carriage. I've been in there since Silver Creek, just me and a couple of old-timers sleeping off the journey." The man with the flashlight took a step closer. He was bigger up close, with a coldness in his eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. "We'd like to check for ourselves." Elias didn't move. He blocked the door. "I said there's no one in there." He drew himself up to his full height, which suddenly felt taller than it had in years. It was not a physical strength he projected, but a moral one, forged in decades of hard work and honest living. "The conductor won't take kindly to you holding up his train, and neither will I." A tense silence hung in the frozen air. The second man muttered something to the first. The flashlight beam wavered, then dropped from Elia's face. They looked at this old man, standing like a sentinel in the cold, and something in his unwavering gaze gave them pause. They were bullies, used to easy prey. They weren't prepared for a quiet, stubborn dignity. With a muttered curse, they turned and trudged back to their truck. Elias stood watching until their taillights disappeared down the dirt road. Only then did he allow himself to lean against the door, his knees weak, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he re-entered the carriage, Cora was weeping silently with relief. The train gave a jolt and began to slowly creep forward. The signal had been cleared. They didn't speak much for the rest of the journey. The shared ordeal had created a bond that needed no words. As the first hints of dawn painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of rose and gold, the skyline of Denver appeared in the distance. A sprawling, intimidating city of promise and uncertainty. The train pulled into Union Station with a final, hissing sigh. Passengers gathered their belongings and filed out into the bustling concourse. Elias and Cora stood together on the platform, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Thank you," Cora said, her eyes shining with tears. She tried to hand him back the worry stone. Elias shook his head. "You keep it for Lily." He looked around the vast station at the rushing crowds. "Do you have somewhere to go, someone to meet?" Cora nodded, a new strength in her voice. "Yes, a friend will be all right." She hesitated, then reached out and squeezed his hand. "Will you?" Elias looked from her determined young face to the rising sun streaming through the station's great windows. He thought of the long night, of the fear, of the moment he had chosen to stand his ground. The weight on his shoulders felt different now. Lighter. It was no longer the weight of an ending, but the weight of a beginning. He picked up his suitcase, the same one he had carried onto the train with such heaviness of heart. "Yes," Elias Thorne said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in months. "I believe I will." He turned and walked into the light of the new day, not as a man fleeing his past, but as a man stepping into his future. The last train to Denver had carried more than just passengers. It had carried a chance at redemption.